Good morning, and thank you for joining us today, Thursday, April 8th, 2021, for our webinar entitled COVID-19 Vaccines, What Will Your Company Do? Presented by Ethos Human Capital Solutions and Merhab Robinson and Clarkson Law Corporation. My name is Denise Ketty, and I am your moderator for today's topic, and I'll introduce you to our expert panel in a moment. The webinar today is being recorded and all attendees are in listen-only mode. The webinar will run approximately 60 minutes in total. Please take a moment now to visit the Handouts area on your GoToWebinar toolbar to download a copy of today's presentation. If you don't see the Handouts area, click on the toolbar to enable the Handouts area to appear. If you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A area on the dashboard at any time during the presentation. If you'd like your question to be directed to a specific panelist, please note that when you're sending in your question. Also, if you are an HR professional and need HRCI credit, please type in HRCI in the questions area so that we can follow up with you after the webinar presentation today. Just a quick reminder that today's webinar is being recorded and all accompanying materials are protected by copyright. The presentation today provides general information and does not constitute legal advice. The information offered during the webinar is as of today, April 8th, 2021, and we always recommend that you consult with your own legal counsel to address your specific situation to ensure you have the most current information on all legal matters. Today, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 vaccine policies. While we're all ready to have the pandemic end and get life back to our new normal, there are important decisions and policies and procedures regarding vaccines that need to be made and communicated to your employees. This is such an important topic that we have two members of the law firm Merhab Robinson and Clarkson here with us to discuss this subject today. Our first legal expert is Curtis Urian. Curtis is an associate at the law firm Merhab Robinson and Clarkson in the firm's transactional department, where he advises clients in real estate, finance, business succession planning, corporate and employment law. In addition to all this work, Curtis has contributed articles to law journals, has been a part-time lecturer, and teaches classes in economics, conscious capitalism, and business law. He's also been recognized quite a few times through 2017 through 2020 as a rising star in Southern California's legal business law. Our next expert today joining us is William Hubbard, and he's an associate also and a co-worker of Curtis's at the firm's transactional department at Merhab Robinson, Merhab Robinson and Clarkson Law Corporation. He practices in the areas of corporate mergers and acquisitions, real estate, and employment law, and has a Juris Doctorate from USC Gould School of Law. And we just found out he's a big Nationals fan, so that works well for our team here as we talk about baseball in the background. Our human capital expert is Linda Duffy, president of Ethos Human Capital Solutions. Sorry, you guys, I have a tickle in my throat today. Linda and her team are known for building the magic of human connection with a unique approach to HR consulting, recruiting, and payroll support programs. The Ethos team works with your company by developing strategies for your business leaders to get the right systems, people, and culture in place with your organization so that your business owner can focus on running your business and achieving your goals. Linda, why don't you introduce everything from here?
Great. Thanks so much, Denise. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We think this is our first webinar of the year, so we're a little out of practice and it seems a little strange to us, but we're glad you could join us today. And I see we already have over 100 people which have joined us, so clearly vaccines is a hot topic. I just wanted to remind people, if you're an HR professional and you are certified through HRCI, this has been pre-approved for 1 hour general recertification credit. So again, just type in HRCI into the question section and we'll be able to find you later, and then we'll be able to send you the follow-up survey and your certificate of attendance. All right, our agenda is pretty simple today. When we first started this and we put this together, 3 weeks ago or so, we were just going to be focused on vaccines. Now that we have the supplemental paid sick leave law, they sort of tie together. So we're going to actually give you some bonus information today on the SPSL. And then of course, we always save room at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions that come up, feel free to type them into the question section. And then when we get to the end, Denise will go through and help us find questions that we haven't already addressed and take care of those for you. What I want to do to start is just launch a poll to see where everybody is. So let's see if this works. Okay, good. So it looks like it's worked on your screen. So just go ahead and take a second. We just want to see where everybody is and know, if you know right now, are you going to make vaccines mandatory for your employees? Yes, no, or maybe you're just waiting to hear what we have to say today, and then you'll make your decision at that point, because we will be talking about it. So hopefully give you all perspectives on, what could work for this and what could make you think maybe it's not the right thing to do. So far, 69% of you have voted. We're just going to give it another couple of seconds here. And then we'll share those results, hopefully, if I can remember how to do that. Okay. All right, let's see, share. Okay, here we go. So there you go. You can see that 55% of you are waiting to hear what we have to say about this today, and 35% of you have already decided no, but 10% of you have decided yes, you're going to make this a mandatory for your business. So that's great to know, and we appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so let's go back to my screen now and go on the next slide. So let's start with the question that's really on a lot of people's mind. This is probably the question that we get asked more than any other question, and that is simply, can we require the vaccine? So I see here it says yes, but with exceptions. So William, why don't you, as our new member, welcome to the webinar team here, why don't you get us started by talking about this and sharing with us your thoughts on the exceptions and what that means?
Sure. Thanks, Linda. So there's sort of two major exceptions, and these are for employees with disabilities that would make receiving the vaccine unsafe, and for employees with a sincerely held religious belief by which they, object to being vaccinated on religious grounds. And these stem from the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and then Title VII of the federal code. And so essentially, if an employee falls into one of these categories, you will be obligated to reasonably accommodate their request to not be vaccinated, as long as it doesn't impose an undue burden on the business. And so what that looks like is you need to engage in what's called the good faith interactive process. Once you're notified by an employee that they believe they fall into one of these categories, you work with them to try to find a solution where they can keep their position and continue to do their job without being vaccinated. So, depending on the industry or the position, that could mean working from home, or a different solution that you all come up with. But those are really the two categories: the disability and the religious belief. And you'll note that just a personal preference or personal reason for not being vaccinated does not qualify an employee for one of these exceptions.
Okay, great. Just a little bit of perspective for people. Fisher and Phelps has been conducting surveys on this, and a survey from earlier this year showed that 64% said they would not make them mandatory. So there's going to be differences, right? Like we already saw in our poll, 10% have said they're going to do it. Some of this is also dependent on what industries you're in, right? So agricultural and food, is like the #1 industry that's going to require the vaccines at 18%. Construction and healthcare are also up there. So it's some of this, you might want to just base this on where you are, your type of business, whether it makes sense for you, those type of things. Now, William already got us started on this to a certain extent. What happens if you do make it mandatory and somebody says, I don't want to be vaccinated? So we talked a little bit about the interactive process. Hopefully most of you are already familiar with that because you've been on our webinars and we've talked about it. Usually in relative to like a leave of absence or accommodating some sort of, medical condition or something like that. But Curtis, why don't you jump in here and sort of add your 2 cents on, what an undue hardship is and, what steps people can take if somebody says they don't want to get vaccinated.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about the interactive process, as Linda mentioned, that's the timely effort to communicate with the employee to figure out if there's an accommodation that can be made that allows the employee to continue to work without getting the vaccine, and whether that accommodation is reasonable. So kind of the first idea that comes to my mind is, well, maybe the employee could work from home. And so that might be a possible accommodation. And you'd have to do the analysis to determine if that is reasonable or not. Now, if everyone in your workforce has been working from home for the last year or so, then it's probably reasonable to continue that process. Now, if you have a food production worker that's working on the line or is pulling boxes in a warehouse to be put on a truck, that's probably not a position that can work from home. So that's just an example of the type of analysis that you'd have to do to determine if the requested accommodation is an undue hardship. So if someone working in food production, working from home, that is an undue hardship because they can't be there. So one of the things that employers have to do when deciding if they're going to mandate vaccines or encourage or incentivize vaccines is evaluate and think to themselves and answer the question of, if somebody absolutely refuses and we are not able to provide an accommodation, is this someone that we're willing to exclude from the workplace? Is this someone that we're willing to discipline, possibly discharge? So the EEOC and the DFDH have both said that if somebody objects and an accommodation is not reasonable, so there's an undue hardship, then the employee can be excluded from the workplace. That doesn't necessarily mean terminated, but there are circumstances where it would be possible to just discharge that person. So like this last point says here, are you ready? Are you prepared to fire your best employee? So these are types of questions and thought processes you're going to want to go through in deciding whether you're going to require vaccines. Because here's a potential problem. You can require vaccines for your workforce, and then your top performer comes up to you and says, no, I object, I'm not going to get it. And then if you make an exception for that person, then you start getting into the world of, well, maybe there's a disparate impact in your decisions, maybe there's a form of discrimination going on, and it just makes the challenge. So the recommendation is to be consistent in your decisions when it comes to mandating the vaccines and disciplining those who object without a good reason, and those that you're unable to accommodate because of an undue hardship.
So Curtis, let me ask you a question about that. What is your feeling on differences within a workforce, right? Making the vaccine mandatory for some but not others. So for example, let's go back. Like yesterday, I got a call. Let's go with this one. Yesterday, I got a call from somebody, and it wasn't about vaccines, but it was about an employee who's been on and off a leave of absence over the last several months, and he's having a hard time working in the office. Well, part of his duties is quality control. He needs to be there to actually see the
Right.
parts being made. He can't do that from home, right? As far as vaccines go, though, would you say that it should be an all or nothing approach, or would it be like, hey, if you're working on the food line, you know that's mandatory, but if you're working in accounting, it's not?
As long as there's a good faith, non-discriminatory motive for treating different departments or different groups or different classes of employees differently, then there shouldn't be an issue. So if the accounting department in the office is not required to get the vaccine, but the manufacturers on the line are required to get the vaccine, that would probably be okay because you're making the distinction based on whether social distancing standards can be maintained. So if you're on the production line and you're required to work within 2 or 3 feet of the next person, then there's a good argument of why the vaccine should be required. But if you're in the office, you're in the accounting team, and you can spread out, and the company chooses not to require the vaccine for those individuals for that very reason, then that should be okay.
Okay, great. Because I have a feeling that that's going to come up a lot, right? Where people are going
Right.
to want to make it mandatory for some, but not for all. And I want our listeners today to understand that that's okay for those reasons that you just said. Okay, so mandatory vaccines. There's pros and cons, right? So what do you guys think? Do you have an opinion one way or the other? We sort of talked about this yesterday, and we just threw out some ideas to get everybody thinking about this. William, any thoughts?
Sure. So I think it obviously is sort of a balance of these different factors. There's obviously a lot of positives to having your employees be vaccinated, and there's also some sort of risks and drawbacks. I think that probably the biggest positive is that you're going to reduce the possibility that your employees contract COVID, and so you're going to have fewer people missing time, fewer instances of needing to pay out sort of these different categories of paid sick leave, which we'll get into a little bit further later on in the webinar. But and then you avoid the possibility of having, like a breakout that can have more serious consequences for the business based on the Cal OSHA order and the other sort of COVID regulations that are out there. At this time, which I think this is also going to come up later, but an employee being vaccinated doesn't exempt them from a lot of these sort of safety and prevention measures that have gone into place, like the Cal OSHA emergency temporary standard. So it's not necessarily the case where you can say, okay, my workforce is vaccinated, so now we're able to do X, Y, Z, which we weren't able to do before, right? So it's possible that will change with new guidance or regulation that comes out over the summer and as the situation continues to evolve. But I think really the benefit is that you're going to avoid having people out sick for extended periods, or that possibility of an outbreak or a more serious situation.
Yeah, all great points. Curtis, you want to weigh in on any of these?
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of reiterate some of the points we've made here with the cons, it's going to be a pain in the rear end to deal with these accommodations issues. And there's going to be a pain in morale among employees who object because they just don't want it, right? So there's kind of a political element too. I'm sure everyone's aware of it. They follow the news and hear different pundits say different things. And there's an element of social networking or social media fake news that's out there. There's a lot of misinformation that's spread. And so there's a lot of people that just don't want it. They're not comfortable with it. And if you're going to mandate the vaccines, you're going to have uncomfortable conversations with people who don't want it. So that's definitely a con. That's something you got to think about and decide if that's something you're ready to handle. Also, from the information that we're seeing, any kind of reactions or responses to the vaccine would fall under a workers' comp policy. If an employee is required to get the vaccine at work, gets the vaccine and has a serious reaction or response. And also, we really don't know what the long-term side effects are of these vaccines. And that's not to assume that the long-term side effects are bad. We just don't know. There's not enough information. There's not enough time to have elapsed to be able to observe if any long-term side effects. So it's like William said, it's a balancing act, trying to weigh the pros and cons and decide what's best for your organization. I'll tell you, William and I are both pro. We've both had both our shots.
As have
but
I.
We know people who are con. Yeah, there's other employees in our firm who've had their second shot, and some have just gotten their first shot. So I know a lot of people who are pro. I think it's going to be helpful, but I know a lot of people who are con. and just because they don't have enough information. So,
Right. Or they
each organization just kind of has to determine on their own.
Yeah, or they have misinformation, right? I mean, I've heard,
Hmm.
we have a client that's a healthcare provider, and I was talking to the vice president there, and she said there's a lot of misinformation where younger people have been told that it could cause sterilization. So she's seeing a lot of younger people who are refusing to get the vaccine, where those of us who are a little bit older, I'm like, I'll be first in line, you know. So everybody
Hmm.
has their own opinion on that. Another thing that everybody needs to think about is if you do decide that you want to make it mandatory, there's a lot of companies that are offering some sort of incentives. It doesn't have to be cash. I just threw that out there because usually I get the question of, you know, what is the, like, what's a typical incentive? I don't have a lot of information on this because I don't know a lot of companies that are offering incentives yet, but I've seen it range from $100 to $500. The $500 came from an article that Denise actually sent me about a Chobani yogurt plant in Idaho. They're doing vaccines on site, and they're telling people they'll pay $500 to each one of them to get vaccinated because they believe it's being a good corporate citizen and that it helps not only the company, but families, the community, everything else. So that's what they're doing. We just want to remind you, if you do go the cash route, then that's going to have to be taxed. I've heard other people suggest they could do some other kind of bonus, like an extra vacation day or something like that. So you can get creative about it. Just make sure that you continue to comply with wage and hour laws if you're going to do that. And if you're going to have your employees vaccinated on site, then make sure that they're on the clock and clocked in so that time gets paid. And we'll talk about those of you that are going to be subject to the SPSL laws, that's going to come into play on there as well. Okay, so Curtis, can the employer require proof of vaccine?
So the answer is yes. The EEOC and the DFEH have both come out and said yes. Information regarding a vaccine is not a medical examination, according to the government agencies. The latest guidance says yes, you can require proof of a vaccine because you're not asking about protected health information. But those of you who've gotten your first or second shots and you get the little card from the CDC, it has your name and birthday, gender, and so forth and so forth and so forth. It has a bunch of personal information on this card. So when employers do ask for proof of the vaccine, they need to be careful that they're not requesting private health information that's protected under HIPAA. So if you ask for a copy of the card, tell the employee that they need to redact out the certain lines of the card that have that protected private health information. And just like any other medical related information that you collect from an employee should go in a separate file. That's a file that's separate from their personnel file with their reviews and evaluations and so forth.
Okay, great.
And I got a question earlier this week with regards to travel. So there's still a lot of travel advisories. If an employee travels to a different country or travels out of state and they want to come back to work immediately, in the last year we've had a lot of employers put in self quarantines because those are the travel advisories. So if you have the vaccine, there's been questions on whether employers can ask if somebody has gotten the vaccine so that they can bypass that travel advisory. Well, so we really don't have a good answer to that yet from the EEOC or DFEH, but the employer can ask if the employer has been vaccinated. We just don't have an answer on whether a person can avoid a travel advisory because of that. Still
Okay,
waiting for information on that.
yeah, we're still waiting information on a lot of things, but so the last thing, William, what I had this question posed to me actually. You know, let's say you have a client, or let's take Ethos as an example, right? We have clients, we sometimes go out on site to clients. What if a client says to me, I only want you to send out an employee if they've been vaccinated? How should I handle that situation?
So I think that's definitely it's tricky because essentially the client is asking you to divulge medical information about an employee, which generally you're discouraged from doing. So I think unless we get some guidance or a clear rule making an exception for information related to vaccination, that the safest sort of course of action would be to just explain, that for these reasons I'm not able to I'm not able to provide that kind of information to you about whether somebody's been vaccinated or not.
Right, because even, I mean, if we were silent on the issue but sent out certain people, that's also troubling, right?
Right,
Or
because
if
they
I
can
have to
probably
say,
figure it out.
right, I'm sorry, that person can come out, but this person can, right? So there's a slippery slope there. So we just wanted to make sure everybody is aware of that. Okay, I don't remember Denise saying this, but she probably did. But in your handout section, you should see a couple of handouts, including copies of the slides from today. So be sure to download those. I also uploaded a poster for you there. So just make sure, because I know some of these slides have a lot of content on them, and I want to make sure you get it. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but just when you're thinking about what you're going to do, whether it's mandatory or voluntary vaccines or whatever, you want to think through different things. Travel is something not on this list that Curtis just mentioned, so you can write that in. But you just want to think through your procedure for if somebody does seek an exemption, from the vaccine, what you're going to do about that. You're going to talk about, whether they get paid for the time, all things. Are you going to require proof? Are you doing incentives? All the things that we're sort of talking about. So think through all of these different items on here as you go to put together your vaccine policy. Now, Curtis, I think you mentioned this already, but if employees get vaccines, can they stop wearing masks? Can they stop being socially distant? Can we just say, woohoo, we're vaccinated, we don't have to do anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I personally, I really want the answer to be yes, because I am sick of wearing the mask.
Right?
But the guidance from the CDC and promotion and various government agencies is unfortunately no. And the reason being, I was just listening to a presentation on Tuesday from LA's top medical advisor. The reason is because the vaccines are in that 90% effectiveness range. So there's probably about 10% people who get the vaccine who can still contract the disease and can still spread it, can still be infectious. So right now, the guidance and the rules from the state are, even if you get the vaccine, you still wear masks because somebody who has the vaccine could still get sick. It's a 90% chance that you're not able to get sick, but the regulatory regime in place right now still wants us to wear masks because there is that 10% risk.
Okay, great. And we sort of touched on this as well. Must employers pay employees the time getting spent vaccinated? So the answer is yes, if vaccines are mandatory, right? Because that's something that you're telling them that they have to do. We're also going to, when we talk about the SPSL, talk to you about coverage. If you're an employer with more than 25 employees, you're going to have that requirement under the SPSL as well, even if it's a voluntary situation. Okay, so speaking of which, let's jump into the SPSL because this is a new law. Hopefully everybody knows that this is in effect for employers in California with more than 25 employees. It became effective on March 29th, but here's the fun part. It was retroactive to January 1st. I always love that when they pass a law, but then say, oh, but you should have been doing this as of January 1st. And this, as of right now, will remain in effect through September 30th, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So let's talk about who is covered. I just mentioned it. There's more than 25 employees. So if you have 25 or fewer, you're not subject to this law, but if you have more than 25, you are. There's also, just so you know, no longer an exemption for healthcare providers. So under the FFCRA and some other laws, they were exempted, but they are not exempted under this law. Okay, so William, why don't you talk about what circumstances trigger this in terms of protection under SPSL? And unmute yourself if you're
Sorry.
muted.
Yep, I was muted. These are going to sound familiar to you because they're basically the same as we saw with the the FFCRA last year, but with the addition of certain qualifying reasons related to vaccination. So if an employee needs to care for themselves because they've been ordered to quarantine or isolate by a government order, or advised by a healthcare provider, or they're seeking a medical diagnosis. And then similarly for family members, if they're caring for a family member in that situation, or if their child's school or usual child care is not available for reasons related to COVID. And then the addition, like I mentioned, is with respect to vaccine. So if an employee needs to take time off to get the vaccine, or if they are experiencing symptoms or side effects from the vaccine and need to take a day or two, then those reasons would qualify for SPSL as well.
Okay, and Curtis, why don't you go through what the pay requirement is and how that works?
Yeah, the pay requirement is basically the 80 hours that we saw under FFCRA. It's just expanded in California. And the employees can request that retroactive pay ever since January 1st when FFCRA expired. And when an employee requests that retroactive pay, the employer has until the next payday for the next full cycle to pay the retroactive amounts. And when the employer goes to create the pay stub, the wage statement, and there's going to be that extra pay, that retroactive pay, there needs to be a separate line item that says this is retroactive SPSL pay.
Yeah, and one of the things we were talking about earlier this week when we were preparing for this is, how do you account for the retroactive pay? Because the interesting thing is, if you think about it, let's say somebody in February went and got the vaccine, right? And then they had some side effects and they were out for the next couple of days. They probably were, they were probably already paid. They're probably already used their sick pay, for example. So now it's already been taken out of their sick pay bucket, but now do we have to put it back in?
That's my understanding, is that that you apply the new SPSL leave first. So you'd have to go back and retroactively apply that, and then you have to give them those sick days back.
Right. And I would just encourage everybody to be very meticulous about your record keeping on this, right? Because especially when you have a requirement to keep track of like sick or vacation or whatever it is, it's already come out of the bucket. So you're going to have a pay stub from February that says they were paid that amount, but now you're going to have to credit it back somehow. So you're going to want to just be really careful about keeping records on this. And then we just made a note at the bottom. The pay calculation is different if you're full-time versus part-time, and it's also different in some instances from the FFCRA calculation. So just reach out if you need help with that, or do a little bit of research on that. We also have, like Curtis just mentioned, the wage statement requirement. So the SPSL has to be a line item on your pay stubs, or you have to come up with a separate wage statement notice that will show people if they've been paid any SPSL. So just reach out to your payroll provider. I found that most of the larger payroll companies are on top of this, but some smaller ones might not be. And then also the poster requirement. You do have a posting requirement. They've also been very specific to say that you can supply that electronically if you don't have employees who are working in an office right now, if you have people working from home. So you would be able to, email it to them, upload it, and notify them where they can find it, those type of things. And I did upload the poster to the handout section so you can download it from there. Okay, so this is a big one, William. Can employers require medical certification before they pay an employee the SPSL?
No, so it's not conditioned upon medical certification. You essentially need to take the employee at their word. There is, however, this exception, which is mentioned on the slide. If you have, as an employer, if you have an independent reason to believe that the employee's request is not valid or that they're not eligible, you can request some supporting documentation. And I think this is a situation where an employee tells you that they're experiencing side effects from the vaccine and they can't come to work, and then a friend tells you that they saw them like out of the golf course or something like that. I think that generally speaking, you are obligated to just take the employee at their word. But again, if you have a real sort of concrete reason for believing that the request is not valid or the employee is not eligible, then at that point you can request some supporting documentation.
So let's go back and let me just drill down a little bit on this. So we said earlier that an employer can require proof of vaccination. So if somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I got vaccinated over the weekend, I want to be paid for that time or something like that, can you ask for proof of vaccination? Or does this only come up if somebody is calling out sick because they had side effects?
That's an interesting question. I think that we talk about the proof of vaccination more in the context of whether an employer can require a vaccination or not. I think, without having seen any totally clear guidance on this, my recommendation would be that because SPSL is not conditioned on medical certification, that you should not ask for proof of vaccination as a condition to the employee taking SPSL for a reason related to the vaccine. But if you were in that situation where you had reason to believe that the employee was not being truthful, or that that they had not been vaccinated like they said, then I think that proof of vaccination would be an appropriate documentation to request, because we do know from the guidance that there are circumstances under which you can ask for proof of vaccination, but again, with the sort of
Right.
more personal medical information omitted.
Got it. And I'm also going to assume that, like for Moderna and Pfizer, those are 2 shots, right? So the same requirement, just to be clear with everybody, is that they're going to have to be paid for the time getting both shots, not 1 shot or anything like that. Just as a reminder. Okay, so here's another one that comes up, Curtis. Can employers require employees to use, state disability insurance or the regular paid sick leave they get from the company before, they get paid the SPSL?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is no. So if somebody has a qualifying reason for SPSL, then you have to allow them to use the SPSL leave first. And then once that expires, then you can look at the different types of leaves that are available after that.
Now, how does that factor in, or is there a different rule if an employee is excluded under the emergency temporary standards that Cal OSHA put out? Can SPSL be used first there?
Yeah, so this has been a little confusing, and our understanding is that you can, but even if the SPSL is exhausted, you'd still have to pay under ETS. Like if there's a second exclusion event, you
Right.
still have to pay.
So can you remind everybody under the ETS, like when we say excluded employee, can you just remind everybody what that's about? Because the laws also,
Yeah, so
the rules around that also changed when SPSL became effective.
yeah, there's a couple different instances when employees would have to be excluded from work, but the main instance is when an employee comes to work sick and exposes other people at work to the coronavirus, to COVID-19. And those people who have been exposed, according to the definitions of ETS, would have to be excluded from the workplace for different time periods that are set forth in ETS. And for the time that they're excluded from the workplace, they must be paid.
If it's a work-related exposure.
Work-related exposure, yes.
Right, okay. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the presentation. I just want to remind everybody to drop any questions you have into the questions section. I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but you'll see it in your slides and hopefully can read it there as well. So there's really 3 different laws that come into play when we talk about COVID-19 pay at this point. You'll remember originally we had the FFCRA that went into effect last April 1st, a year ago, April 1st. That sunsetted at the end of December. Then the government said, oh, but if you want to voluntarily pay people under the FFCRA, you can still seek tax credits through March 31st. And then Biden came out and said, oh, wait, we have this 2021 American Rescue Plan. So that pretty much is the same as FFCRA, but it now gives people an additional 80 hours that they can take, but it is still optional to employers. So you can voluntarily comply with that. You can give people an additional 80 hours and seek a tax credit for it. That applies to anybody with 500 or less than 500 employees. So that one is voluntary. The Cal-OSHA emergency temporary standards that Curtis just referenced, that one, the pay requirement is required, but that is specifically if an employee has to be excluded because they had a workplace exposure and they are able and willing to work. So it became more narrow when the SPSL went into effect, because it used to be that we would be paying them, for all sorts of different reasons to sit out of work if there was a workplace exposure, if they had COVID from it, whatever. And now it's very isolated. Simply, if there was a workplace exposure, they're able and willing to work, they must be paid. And so that applies to all California employers. And then we have SB 95, which is the supplemental paid sick leave, which again is also required, but that applies to companies with more than 25 employees. And that is also 80 hours that we've been talking about for a whole variety of reasons. So this is even more of an eye chart, so I apologize for that, but I wanted to show you we have these new reasons under the first column on the left for reasons employees can take leave. So the top ones were the ones we've had sort of all along under the FFCRA, and then added to that is time off to get vaccinated, right? Or is time off related to symptoms. So I get the vaccine, I get paid for that time, and then I'm sick for the next couple of days because I have some sort of reaction from the vaccine. That time has to be paid now under the SPSL and can voluntarily be paid under ARPA. And then also if you're waiting for test results or medical diagnosis related to COVID-19, that is now specifically called out under the American Rescue Plan. Okay, so I know this is a lot of information thrown in here, and with that, we will take whatever questions you have and do our best to answer them. So I'm going to turn it back over to Denise.
Yeah, we have we have a lot of questions. We're trying to answer some questions in the background, but what I'm going to do is just go straight down the list because there are a lot. One of the first ones we got at the beginning of the presentation was, can we require the employee to present a doctor's letter verifying a medical exemption?
So somebody says they need an accommodation because they have a medical condition. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's part of the interactive process is getting a medical certification from the employee's doctor or healthcare provider, confirming that an accommodation is needed.
Curtis, do you have a recommendation? What if they go with the other exemption and it's a sincerely held religious belief? How do you prove or not prove that?
Yeah, so there are some established religions that hold that as a core tenet, a core belief of no vaccination. So if the member demonstrates that, or if an employee demonstrates that they are a member of a religious organization that has that as a core tenet, then that's an accommodation that you need to evaluate. But there probably will be situations where an employee comes up and says, well, it's against my religion. And they're not really able to demonstrate that they're a member of one of these established religions that have no vaccines as part of their core tenets. So, but we actually have to follow the United States Supreme Court's guidance on this, and the employer has to determine if it's a sincerely held belief, right? So it's not just, I believe, I have my own religious convictions and it's against my religion. It has to be a sincerely held belief. And the Supreme Court has kind of talked about that in a handful of different cases. And it basically what it means is it's a religious belief that that they can demonstrate that is core to whatever their religion is, and it's a belief that they've had for a period of time. So it's not just like they made it up on the spot and said, "Oh, it's against my religion," type thing.
It can't be like religion of Linda.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Church of Munda.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me go back to what you were saying earlier, William. So we got a question about people asking about, proof. What if someone is pregnant, and is that an exception to not getting vaccinated if you're in a company that wants you to be vaccinated?
So that would fall under the disability exception, I think, and that would be something where I don't think as a general principle that the vaccine is considered unsafe for pregnant women. But if an employee were pregnant and objected to the vaccine on those grounds, that is something that I think they would need. You would engage in the process and you would ask for some sort of certification from their healthcare provider that they believe that for that employee's particular situation that the receiving the vaccine would be unsafe.
Okay.
And Curtis, I don't know if you want anything to add or
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I have a friend right now who is pregnant, due in about a month or so, and she went ahead and got the shots. Her doctor said it was safe. But the data and the research isn't well established on pregnant or breastfeeding mothers. There just haven't been enough studies on it yet. The doctors and CDC, from what they've observed, they haven't seen any issues, but it is completely possible that a healthcare provider may not want or may instruct that their patient not get the vaccine because they are pregnant or breastfeeding. And so they just get a note from the doctor saying that they don't need to get it.
So now that we're still talking about vaccines, we had a question that came in that said, if an employer makes a vaccine mandatory, can they become liable if an employee develops long-term side effects?
Yeah, so this is one of the slides we addressed. The answer is probably yes. It would probably be a workers' comp illness or a workers' comp disability.
Here's another question for you. If you do not require the vaccine, can you have employees sign a waiver of liability if they contract the virus and get sick? So if you're in a company that doesn't mandate the vaccine.
That is a no.
That is wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
California law expressly prohibits those types of waivers.
When you say those kind of waivers, Curtis, can you expand on that a little bit? Because we do get this
Yeah,
question a lot, actually.
Yeah, waiving any kind of injury or disability or illness that can be contracted or that could happen at work. The workers' comp laws say, because it would fall into workers' comp, and the workers' comp laws say you cannot waive or settle or resolve or release any kind of potential claim outside of the WCAB. It has to be done in front of an administrative law judge. So just a simple waiver saying, I don't want the vaccine, but I'll waive any consequences if I get sick. It's just not enforceable. It's not even something I would even try to do.
Yeah. I have a question. Either one of you can take it. We had talked earlier in this week about this. I think a lot of times we get conflicting guidance, right? Where, the state of California tells us something, the White House tells us something, the CDC says something else, OSHA says something else, Cal OSHA says, like it's a little bit all over the place. And I know, like, especially like travel related stuff, CDC recently came out with some guidance. What's your best advice for employers when the CDC comes out and says, oh, it's okay, make something out. You can stop wearing masks, but Cal OSHA says, nope, you got to still keep wearing masks. Like, what's your best advice for employers on that?
Yeah, so my advice would be consistent with things I've said in the past. An employer has to follow the most restrictive regulation or the most restrictive law. So if the CDC comes out and says it's okay to do one thing, but California health officials say, no, it's not okay, then you still have to follow the California health officials.
Right. And I
We
think,
actually had this happen right when ETS came out, like the
right.
week before. I don't remember exactly what it was. I think it was something about waiting
It was
periods
the
about
10,
returning to work.
it was the 10 days versus the
Yeah,
14.
10 versus 7.
Yeah. Yeah.
7, 10, or 14. CDC said something like a couple days before ETS came out, and ETS had inconsistent information. And at the time, we said, well, it's possible this could change, but as of today, we have to follow what California is saying.
Right.
And California, a couple weeks later, did change to be consistent with the CDC. So, they usually do work together, but whenever there is an inconsistency, you just have to follow whichever law or regulation is more restrictive.
Yeah. And I think, William, you had pointed out also, sometimes when somebody comes out, they're not a law-making entity, right?
Right. It is very tricky, but you should try to distinguish. Like the CDC provides a lot of guidance, a lot of helpful guidance, a lot of guidance that is ultimately incorporated into a law or a regulation or an order, but the CDC itself does not create laws, right? So it's important to distinguish between, the CDC recommendation versus a Cal OSHA order, because they are different. And so that is something when you are reading, a piece of guidance or recommendation, to ask yourself, who is this coming from? And does this agency, have the authority to bind me to this recommendation? And it's not always going to be obvious or clear, but that should be sort of an initial question to ask yourself when you are, presented with something like that.
Right.
So
Denise, do we
that's
have some more
actually,
questions?
oh yeah, yeah, we do. So actually, William, that's a good segue. So because of all the differences and the different rules and regulations we've had in the last year, as we open up to more travel and people are starting to take more vacations, can we require them to quarantine for 2 weeks prior to returning to the office? And if they're not vaccinated. So if we want them to quarantine, but we want them to quarantine unpaid, is that possible if they're not vaccinated?
Right. So this is an interesting question, and it's a tricky area. I think that it will, and Curtis, you might want to add to this, but I think that it depends whether, if Orange County Department of Public Health has an order saying that, all Orange County residents who travel for non-essential travel must quarantine for 2 weeks upon returning. That sounds like, a government order ordering the person to quarantine, which would make them eligible for SPSL. If it's just guidance or recommendation, then they likely do not fall under that qualification for SPSL. And there could be a theory under which you could require them to take that leave unpaid. So that is sort of a tricky area, and we're looking for and hoping for more guidance with respect to travel specifically. But Curtis, I don't know if you had any other thoughts or if you've seen anything else on that.
Yeah, so just like you said, right now we're really under travel advisories. We're not under any mandatory travel bans or travel quarantines. So if an employer is going to adhere to one of the travel advisories, it still can. It just needs to be consistent and do it with all of the employees who travel. And
Right.
this last weekend, the CDC came out and said that those who have had the vaccine can travel without having to quarantine. But we've not seen that trickle down to California yet. So the travel advisory in California is still based on prior information. It's not been changed yet based on what the CDC has said. It might. I hope it does. But we're still stuck under the travel advisories. And they're not mandatory. They're just advisories.
So you're just talking about the SPSL and that it was retroactive. Linda mentioned it earlier that it came out, it was retroactive to January 1. Is it only retroactive if an employee requests it? We've had quite a few people ask if an employee hasn't requested it, does an employer have to go back and pay it instead of sick days? So are they mandated to do that, or do they have to wait for the employee to request it? On the SPSL.
I'm not sure I know the answer. William, do you know?
I don't know for sure. I know that the way the law is written, it is written as though the employee has the first sort of affirmative obligation to make the request. There's nothing in the law that requires an employee to affirmatively or proactively act to correct something like that. However, the safest bet, I mean, I think if you're aware of a situation where an employee is due retroactive pay, I think it can't hurt to just proactively go ahead and take care of it as if they had requested. But and maybe this is another area where we'll get more guidance, whether it's in an FAQ or something like that. But the letter of the law is that if an employee requests it, the employer must grant it. But it's not. Employers must go through all of their employees who took time off between January and March, and if they find something, they need to correct it themselves.
We just have to remember that we do have the posting requirement. So there's the notification part of that.
Right.
So don't stick it in a drawer and go like, hey, nobody asked for it.
You would imagine if the employees know about it, which they should, that they would request it. So.
And I'm sure if one employee knows, then everybody else knows.
Yeah.
As the way it goes.
Generally the case.
Yeah.
We have time
I know we
for
only have
one more question. Yeah.
Okay, let's just do one more question because this came up a couple different times. Is if you're in a company that requires you to get a COVID vaccine, what if someone has had COVID previously and they're using that as an excuse not to get vaccinated? Can they use it as an excuse not to get vaccinated?
So in my opinion, that doesn't clearly fall into the disability. Obviously it doesn't fall into the religious exception. I understand obviously that, if you had COVID 2 weeks ago, you're unlikely to contract it again for a certain period of time. But what I would recommend, going back to something Curtis mentioned earlier, is that if you do have a vaccination policy, you need to apply it consistently. I don't know that I would recommend. I mean, like we talked about earlier, possibly having a different vaccine policy for workers depending on their role or their position. Whether they're in an office and can work remotely versus whether they're in a job that requires them to be physically present. I'm not sure that I would recommend breaking off a separate category for an employee who claims that they recently had COVID and therefore don't need the vaccine. I don't know, Curtis, if you feel differently.
I agree. I don't feel differently. The recommendation that I've seen people receive who did contract COVID-19 is that they still get the vaccine, and the reason being is some of the testing was not that reliable. So some people may have thought they had COVID-19, but it was really a different disease, and vice versa. And there are 4 or 5 different variants, mutated strains of the disease that are present here in the state that could possibly reinfect someone. So everything that I've heard from the CDC and different health leaders is that even if you did contract COVID-19, you should still get the vaccine. And I know people personally who contracted COVID-19 and went ahead and still got the shot.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. And, personally, I encourage everybody to get vaccinated. I think it's going to help everybody, but it is a company decision and a personal decision. So we will leave it at that. William and Curtis, thank you so much for joining us today. I always appreciate learning from you guys. Denise, thanks for moderating as always, and thanks to everybody for attending. If you have questions regarding COVID or vaccines or SPSL or anything out, reach out to me or somebody on my team, Curtis, William, our emails are right there. We do not have another webinar scheduled. If you have a topic that you want us to address, then please email it to me or drop it into the question area right now, because we're always looking for topics that we think will add value to our clients. And then also just be on the lookout. We're going to have a special offer to everyone for attending today's presentation. So that will be sent out shortly. So just keep your eye on that as well.
And if I could just add one more thing, Linda, sorry, before you sign off.
Yeah.
We did have a lot of questions, and we'll do our best to follow up on the questions that we were not able to answer during the presentation. And quite a few people did send in notes asking if this was recorded. Yes, it will be recorded, and we'll post it on the YouTube Ethos HCS site probably later on this afternoon, so that if you want to go back or share the recording with everybody or other people in your office, you can do that.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Denise. A lot of people don't know we do have a YouTube channel that has all of our prior webinars that we'll say successfully recorded, because sometimes the recording gods don't cooperate. But if you go to youtube.com and then /ethoshcs.com, we upload all of the recorded webinars there, so you can search by topic or, whatever you want. You can also subscribe to that channel so you'll get a notification when a new webinar is posted. And Curtis, I don't know if you know, or maybe Denise knows what your YouTube channel is. Do you know?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, but
Yeah,
we do
'cause I
post
think,
the video to our page too.
okay, yeah. So you guys can probably find it by just, searching in YouTube someplace. But either way, as Denise said, we'll get that posted as soon as the recording gets rendered, and we make sure that it's all good. All right. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and just reach out if we can help you with anything else. Thanks so much and have a great day.